You just literally meant you're going, hi y'all, welcome to the PB focused info session for participatory budgeting in Seattle, Washington. The RFP has come out. It is time for community to get engaged and get excited as we move towards picking the third party administrator for the participatory budgeting process in Seattle, Washington. I'm excited because I'm here with two folks from OCR who are going to do their intros as well. But y'all, community is going to be leading PB, and so it's kind of fun to kick it off in this way. I'm going to pass it to John Page with Office of Civil Rights to frame us up so that you know what we're going to be watching today. Thanks so much, John.
Right on, Sean. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Sean said, I'm John Page, and right now I'm the we stood up a new division in the Office of Civil Rights, City of Seattle, and it's the Community Investment Division, and I'm managing that division and working alongside Mano and Jackie to particularly around the participatory budgeting process at the city, but also a couple of other funding processes that the Office of Civil Rights has been leading the past couple of years. And so we released the RFP, and I'm gonna let Mano get into that because I don't want to hog the mic. I can be a little loquacious. But yeah, we released an RFP a week ago today. And we were, to be honest, it was a long slog, y'all. And you know, we're grateful for all the grace community has shown us, and we're grateful to be in this place of really trying to stand in the gap for community with community in the institution. So, if Mano, if you want to talk a little bit about the RFP and talk where we go from here. That would be great. It's good to be here. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, am I up next, Sean? Yeah, so like JP mentioned, John, we released the RFP last week. This past Tuesday on the 9th, we had our first info session. If you aren't able to make it to that, we will be, there is a recording available online, which you can check out. Where this is currently focused and will be presented on by the Black Brilliance Research Project folks. The focus is on the Black Brilliance Research Project. So folks, so everybody gets a little bit of an understanding of what what brought us here and how this participatory budget it has been shaped. And then our last info session is going to be on December 14th, where we'll talk more about frequently asked questions, but mainly about making sure everybody understands how to submit a budget that makes sense, any questions that are final. The submission deadline is Wednesday, January 5th at 11:59 p.m. But please submit questions to us as late as the same day, January 5th at 5 p.m. Really excited to be here, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me for any questions. I am the person that is set up to answer and be the comms person around this RFP process. I'll pass it back to you, Sean.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited, y'all. I would love to see this go to communities, like folks led work. You know how I love having community led work. I'm joined here by Latanya Sevier, who I was going to drum roll into this session. And we're going to be doing a train the trainer, basically. For those of you who've been following us, you know that we have been in camera, Zoom call after Zoom call, telling community about this process. Today's gonna be a little different. We are going to kick off like a normal train the trainer where we show some videos to kind of set the historical context. And then we are gonna go through and talk a little bit about the research methods and just little juicy bits, can't help it. And then we'll get into what PB process looks like. It's very important that whoever has this understands what PB is. Right, understands what they get themselves into. And it's important that community has a chance to understand as well. So with that said, Latanya, if it's okay, I think I'll go ahead and queue up this first video. And while I do that, do you want to introduce yourself for the good of the order?
For sure. I'm Latanya Severe. I use they, them pronouns, and I worked with Sean throughout the Black Brilliance Research Project, and worked with a couple of folks who are here as well.
Okay, so y'all, if you're ever looking for this, you go to this link here, click on that first link, you'll be taken to these templates. These templates are what we've created for a community to know how PB is supposed to go, what it is. You'll have seen this if you were participating in any way, shape, or form and following the Black Brilliance Research Project. But if you missed out, don't worry, we're going through all these slides today. The very first page is the menu style of what PB is. We are going to go through a couple of these videos, and then we're going to take you through slide by slide your guide to doing PB here in the Seattle, Washington area. We're going to kick it off with this video for historical context, followed by another one. There's captions at the bottom here. That's extremely helpful for me. And with that said, I'll mute my mic and go ahead and share.
Oh, Sean, is there supposed to be audio? Sorry.
A lot of opinions about policing. People have a lot of opinions about policing, and our ideas about policing are shaped by our race, our genders, our class, and our parents. For example, most white people have very little interaction with police. In a recent study, 77% of white people had no contact with police in the previous year. Of those who did, at least half were traffic stops. And in many cases, white people initiated contact by calling the police. Since they have little unwanted contact, many white people's opinions about policing are not based on personal experience. Dominant culture, especially mass media, sells us the image of officer-friendly, but whose experience is that actually based on? The same study found that Black people experience excessive force at the hands of police at more than twice the rate of white people. Did we have a just and equitable police force and something went wrong? No. Policing in the South emerged from the slave patrols in the 1700s and 1800s that caught and returned runaway enslaved people. In the West, police departments were formed to keep Native people out of cities built by white settlers. And in the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped quash labor strikes and riots against the rich, and policed public spaces to conform to middle-class white morality around gender and sexuality and exclude poor, unhoused, or disabled people. Policing in the U.S. began as a system of economic, social, racial, patriarchal, and ableist control. And that is what it still is today. The truth is police don't do what most people think they do. Police spend more than half of their time responding to non-criminal calls and traffic issues, and only 1% to 3% of their time responding to violent crime calls. Police don't stop violence. They respond to violence that has already occurred, and they respond with their own threat of violence. And that response is not equitable. When people of color are involved, police often engage violently. Yet we spend an astronomical amount of money on the police, over $100 billion a year. Let that sink in. The demand to defund the police is about minimizing the role and power of police in our society. It's about demanding that the government stop writing blank checks for racist control, containment, and punishment. Defunding the police is also about recognizing that police do not solve or address any social issues. They do not prevent harm. What if we took that $100 billion and invested it in our community? What if we had housing, access to healthy food and clean water, health care, healing, cooperative businesses, education, child care, parks, art, and community services? If you already have those things, great. But that's not the reality everywhere. Ask yourself, if we have the resources, why doesn't everyone have this? And our ideas about
I could be a little quicker with my camera skills, I would. So that's video number 1. And you may be thinking, okay, like historical context, I'm hearing about divesting from police, I'm hearing reinvesting in community. What does this have to do with participatory budgeting? If that is you, I can tell you we're getting there. This next video, I think, will actually help frame it up a little bit more. Was one of the first things you need to know about PB as it's conceptualized here in Seattle, Washington, is that it's conceptualized in part as the mechanism that we use to connect the divest strategies and the investment strategies for Black and Brown communities. This next part that I'm going to show you, I'll show you how to get here. Boop, boop, boop. If you click again on that menu, you'll get here. This is part of the Black Brilliance Research Project report that we created. It's just, we broke it out into chapters. You get the big, nearly 1,300 page one, or you get this version. And if you were to click on number 2, researcher demographics and research methods, it will pop open this little baby that talks about those details. Oh, you know what? I didn't show you all the second video. The second video is here, which is Message to the Future. This will be the last video we show before we give a deep dive into what this is gonna look like. So pop that, mute this, make it big. There we go. Pause it from the beginning. Okay, great. So this video is helpful as we start to think about the reinvest side a bit more acutely. This was made a little over a year ago, I believe. Stop sharing my screen and reshare so I can get the right buttons. Share, optimized. And we'll talk about this in a minute. I'll go ahead and hit the sound up, play. There we go.
Looking back, it's hard to believe that we've rebuilt our community from the ground up with our own hands. The first seeds were planted way back in the terror and tenderness of the pandemic. And then change bloomed in the streets, in the fire and struggle of the uprisings. Around here, we'll never forget the day that the last prisoners were released, walking out into the arms of their loved ones. The easy part was finding work. The Community Care Corps was always looking for people in those days, whether for universal family care, burying border walls, or green new public housing, going up one pod at a time. Yep, it was a good time for busy hands.
Funny, thinking back to the first wave of the pandemic, that's what you really remember. Hands. Washing, scrubbing, disinfecting, washing again, picturing each other's hands, all the hands that had touched whatever we were touching, the hands that packed the box, that picked the tomato, that planted the seed, the hands that stroked the brow, that said goodbye. The hands were us, all of us. That web of hand-to-hand, breath-to-breath relationships was a reminder. We are all entangled, making each other sick, keeping each other alive. That was just one of the lessons of COVID-19. It started in the first great pause, when the smog cleared and the rich fled the cities, when poverty dropped its disguise and racist inequality drew the map of the disease. As the roar of the traffic faded, we arose to birdsong and ambulance sirens. The virus showed us what was truly essential. And we learned again and again that so many of us doing essential work were being treated as sacrificial. From nursing homes to detention facilities, meatpacking plants, and fulfillment centers, the virus exposed the cruelty of these warehouses of efficiency and profit. Then, things got worse. In 2023, super droughts led to mega floods. Locusts carved a path across continents and hyper typhoons drove millions from their homes. COVID-23 raced through storm shelters and refugee camps. Supplies ran out again. Meanwhile, dinosaurs roamed the halls of power, bellowing that more sacrifice was needed. But every time they cranked up that rusty old machine called economic growth, the cloud of sickness and death grew.
And we couldn't breathe. Couldn't breathe from the asthma in our polluted communities, from the smoke of those fires. We couldn't breathe with a knee on our necks, in the clouds of tear gas as we shouted, "Black Lives Matter." And that is how the virus changed everything. We finally understood that we couldn't keep patching up the same broken systems. We had to build something new. What was needed was a spark. That spark was us. After months of organizing, the viral rent strike was like a starting gun. Then came the essential workers' strike. Delivery drivers, street cleaners, and farm workers got together and said, "Enough." This time, people didn't just clap from their balconies. We flooded into the streets to join together. One of the leaders was Luciela, a young food courier. When a police bullet stole her life, the crowds exploded in size and then exploded again, spreading across borders like a counter-virus. The sparks looked different in every country as the wildfire strikes leapt across borders. Economies ground to a halt, this time blockaded by workers. We lost too many young heroes as states brought out the iron fist, but it was no match for the raised fist of solidarity. Soon, authoritarian rulers started to topple like statues, and new governments were suddenly nervous about ignoring the streets. We joined hands and pushed further, launching the years of repair.
The first step was rebuilding the economy around the core of essential work: food and farming, care for young and old, public health. Not to mention the essential labor of the more than human world, the winged pollinators, the leafy oxygen makers. The Full Employment Act made the new priorities clear, and there was a wave of new worker cooperatives in everything from mental health support to public art and tree planting. Many bosses were made redundant. Our information ecology needed tending too, and so we built a digital commons, vaccinated it against surveillance, and built up our herd immunity to disinformation. Fossil fuels were running on fumes by that point, so we harnessed their final profits to clean up their messes. Whatever we could, we did outdoors. School, theatre, celebrating. At first because it was safer, then because we realised it made us happier. Nobody talked about missing shopping. Anyway, the right to repair movement meant that a lot of stuff got fixed rather than thrown away and replaced. With life moving at a slower pace, we finally had time to look back. And we began the most important repair of all: repairing relationships. In colonial countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, Those were hard conversations. But truth and reparations commissions helped some of us face the truth about the violent conquests of the past and how they shaped our world. That guided where we repaired and how. It turned out that once we fully funded schools and housing and healthcare, we didn't need those bloated budgets for policing, prisons, and war. And ultimately, the flow of money on planet Earth had to be reversed. So the North finally started paying its debts, and the South finally stopped.
Around here, the Land Back program began the historic process of returning some of the stolen land to indigenous jurisdiction. In the process, we remembered how taking care of the earth lays the ground for taking care of each other. Within just a few years, we could see the bottom of the river again, and it was safe to drink and fish in its waters. Things aren't perfect, of course. Between mutating viruses and our warming world, there's always new storms headed our way. But when they come, we're ready. With our networks of nurses and neighbors, our small farms and big forests, our systems of care and repair. No one is sacrificed. Everyone is essential.
All right, while I get this video to stop playing, I feel like this is a pretty good start. What do you think, Laytanya?
Yes, definitely. I love both those videos. Yeah, as Sean kind of talked about as before we saw the second video, this is like understanding the divest, invest aspect of the work is crucial to really understanding like how we got to this RFP in Seattle. And I feel like that second video really shows like how we reinvest and what we need for reinvestment. And as you'll see in a little while, that's what the research shows. And so shall we jump into the slides? Do you want to just jump in there?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen. A couple of people asking for the links privately, so I just dropped them in the chat. They're also, just a quick reminder, here in our toolkit. And that teach-in slides, these two videos, that's what that is. We even have how long it takes to watch them as a component in the name. We did not make these animated videos. These are wonderful videos that other folks made very lovingly. And so we consider them to be fairly essential to understanding PB. If y'all can believe it, like just a quick moment before I hop into the slides. This process was born out of decades of organizing, right? Like communities coming together to say, stop, seriously, stop funding the things that are hurting us and start reinvesting that money into places that we know we need it. Stop using systems of oppression and really start thinking about what healing, resilience, and justice could look like. And in Seattle, Washington, and King County, we live in a place where there are stated commitments on the books about really integrating race and social justice into everything we do. And when it comes to listening to community, we know that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily argue with that in theory, but in practice, it has taken decades of organizing, especially by Black folks and Black Indigenous people coming together to really push for this. Last year, when we kicked off the research, it was during the summer, a time of social unrest, uprisings, people organizing and fighting for justice in defense of Black lives, in defense of Black thriving, and in defense of Black and Indigenous people really having what we need to thrive. We will be talking about the research, of course, because it's really fun and cool. It's not every day that a city decides that they're going to allow community to hire 100 or so community members to create the future. So it is really remarkable. But at the end of the day, like the overall vision is to have we the people decide what happens to those public funds, and to do it in a way that really recognizes that legacy of harm that's been done to our communities and see it as a commitment to create a better world together, based on the priorities that we've heard from community needs to be centered and following a model that community has said would get us to where we need to be. With that said, I'll go ahead and share the screen. We're gonna go past that menu, juicy as it is, and look at this first screen here. I think what I'll do to make this a little easier is I'll zoom in. And Laitanya, do you wanna be the one that kind of guides us through this one?
Sure. And then maybe we'll head back to the research method. Yeah, so just a little bit about participatory budgeting. The participatory budgeting project has been a great resource around the country around this issue, and we borrow from them this nice guide that kind of walks you through it. So participatory budgeting is a democratic process in which community members decide how to spend part of a public budget. We often say, as I said, it gives people real power over real money. Folks often say that a budget is kind of the city's moral contract. We show what we prioritize by how we fund it, and giving community the opportunity to decide without kind of the interference of elected officials who typically want to be reelected, gives people the actual power to make decisions about how money can best improve the lives of them and their community. So participatory budgeting, or sorry, PB Works is kind of an annual cycle of engagement where the public decides how public money is spent. This is the roadmap that we use in our research. So designing the process, community designs the PB process, and outreach starts, a steering committee is selected. Kind of the research helped to build out a bit of a roadmap that can be useful for getting right into the outreach into a steering committee. You'll see that in the report and through the slides that we'll present today. After that, you have the idea phase. Community submit ideas about how to use PB funds, and scoping starts. And from there, they develop proposals that then get voted on by any and everyone. And you'll see in the report, we try not to exclude anyone, even folks who cannot participate in electoral politics due to disenfranchisement, are able to participate in PB. And there's ways to also assist folks who are unfortunately institutionalized, either may that be in our criminal legal system or in our psychiatric system. There's ways that we map out that can be helpful ways to engage those folks. And I believe young people as young as 10.
That's right, double digits.
Participate as well. And so it really is an opportunity to get as many voices involved and as many people involved as possible. And then the last part is funding winning projects, where winning ideas are funded and followed up with until they happen. That's kind of the full cycle of participatory budgeting, and that's what the RFP would have the contracted org managing. Some of the impacts of PB, it helps to increase civic engagement. You can get folks engaged in PB who maybe never voted, who don't feel very welcome in other civic processes, or like your typical budgeting cycle with council or the city or the county. It's a stronger and more collaborative relationships between residents, government, and community orgs. It's more inclusive, as I mentioned, a lot more people can participate. Especially those who have historically been marginalized. It's an opportunity for new community leaders to emerge, as folks have a variety of roles, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And it's more equitable and effective public spending. It's happening all over the country. New York has 100,000 people deciding $40 million worth of funds. Oakland has a process. Arizona has a public high school process. There's some processes that are exclusive to schools. there's in Vallejo, California, Boston, Massachusetts has a $1 million each year for PB, and over 3,000 cities around the world. And I should say this process, I don't remember the city. What city was PB started? Sean, do you
Porto
remember?
Alegre and Brazil.
Perfect. Yes. And so that's where how PB came from Brazil to the rest of the world. And it's a really amazing process that really gives people some power in the budgeting process.
It's super exciting to think about a process that was born with like Black and brown folks in Brazil from working class backgrounds coming up and saying, hey, let's do something different. Let's do something that's actually going to change the material conditions of lives. Yeah, and it's just spread all around the world. So yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And our process, this slide is just another way of representing that. Our process is built on that. So I want to talk about what community wants, but a lot of times people want to know, how do we get there, right? And so with that said, remember that report I was telling you about, how we have broken out for y'all? Researcher demographics and researcher methods, talk about that, research methods. And so super quick, the researchers participating in this process went through what is called a research ethics training. So everyone went through, got their city certificate, took hours for most folks. Some folks breezed through it in a cool 45 minutes. But everyone went through research ethics training. This is important because people learned about the ways in which power has been used to harm humans through research, and how to be accountable researchers in ways that are recognized by just research ethics boards, etc. We also did onboarding meetings to help provide context, answer questions, provide support. We made a research cookbook, which describes how to do the research. It has templates, examples, step-by-step guides. We had video and live training. We had professional researchers as well as community researchers, lots of technical assistance, capacity building support. Let's see what else is here. We had anti-oppression educations and discussions regularly. That's all really important because relationships are one of the most important components to doing responsible research, effective research that's actually going to reach people, that's going to not just engage people on the surface level, but really allow for that brilliance, wisdom, expertise, and leadership to shine. The relationships of the research is important because we've had over 100 researchers on the process, over 100. We had youth and elders. We had people with different levels of experience in the criminal legal system. We had people with different experiences with homelessness, foster care. We had artists and healers and educators and programmers and, right? We had a really diverse team that had various different origins. And so some people, are refugees or immigrants. We have people who are born here, people who are transplants, people who are here for generations since time immemorial. We had a lot of people really supporting this research and doing this research. And researchers were very involved in every step of the process. And so sometimes when we say we have 100 researchers, a lot of times, like, you remember this, people were like, right, researchers, but who's actually collecting the data, who's actually designing the questions, who's actually analyzing? We're like, the researchers. This was a situation where community members who are expert in their lived experiences are doing research and being recognized for it. And everything from developing the research topics and questions to doing the analysis and reporting the findings. Researchers aren't just collecting data, they're bringing that lived experience with them, they're bringing that expertise with them. And so that is part of it too. And part of that, it goes to how to best collect data, right? How to talk to people in ways that really builds enough rapport to be able to collect data. And then how do you really take care of that relationship in the long term? So it's not just this transactional, thanks for your data, I'm gone, but really thinking about it and the larger scope of the relationships we're building in community. Also thinking about accessibility and accountability. So creating something where every week there were multiple touch points for the research. Every Monday we had teach-ins where community members could come in, learn about the research, ask some questions. We're reporting out, we're saying what we're learning, so that by the time we turn in the report, people feel like they already kind of knew what it was going to say, right? Because they've been following through and coming to our teach-ins, and some of which were also in the press. We also had twice a week office hours where people could come in and give us feedback. And so whether that is elected officials, whether that is community members, whether that is people who are just really interested in the process or wanted to give critical feedback, that was an opportunity every single week for community to come in and shape that process. I don't know about y'all, but usually when people do research, they kind of come in with their questions, collect their data, bounce, write something secretly, and then finally reveal. That was not this research. This research was very open from jump and had many opportunities for people to give us feedback. And some of the best information we collected was during those office hours where people came in and asked questions like, okay, well, what about this part? Or if you're designing accountability, what about this? So super helpful. The next thing that, I just need to move the window so I can see it. The next thing that I'll say related to the research design and relationships is relationships really happened across teams as well. So every team, whether that was Freedom Project or the Silent Task Force or Bridging Cultural Gaps or Sacred Community Connections, or all these different organizations that supported the work, whether it's Forever Safe Spaces, and we'll be listing more people on the next screen, these organizations met internally. But the best parts were when people had a chance to build across teams as well, so that you could have a situation where community members who've never had the opportunity to get to know each other, who've never had the opportunity to build or facilitate a project together, have multiple opportunities to practice in a way that allows them to really build new collaborations and new insights. And many of those teams have really started to build something even more deeply after participating in this phase of the research. So here are the research teams. So we've got Black Trans Prayer Book, Bridging Cultural Gaps, East African Community Services, Forever Safe Spaces, Freedom Project, King County Equity Now, Sacred Community Connections, Silent Task Force, Wanawari, right? We've got all these different orgs, plus community members that weren't necessarily associated with an org that participated in this. All in all, outside of the part that the city of Seattle funded, there were other funding sources that supported this work, and over 200 total researchers, including volunteers supporting from the summer through February. Huge project. Our criteria for participating in the research team: you have to be curious, you have to be accountable to the communities you're connected to, and you have to build and support relationships with each other and with community. And so what's really exciting about that is you have unapologetically a research process that at its core is about creating something that is built on the priorities of Black and Brown communities, that is built on the idea that relationships really matter, and that is going to generate new knowledge like what we've created together. Demographics are here. I'm not going to read through them all because what's really difficult about this is it's such a diverse group of people that these numbers can't even adequately explain it. But this is some information about the researchers here. Okay, so I know that we have a lot here about the background context, but for the specific methods that we used case studies, focus groups, interviews, surveys, photo voice, story mapping, a variety of different research methods, including methods that you don't normally see in a research context. Photo voice, for example, like when you take pictures of injustice and you imagine what justice could look like and you really talk through that with community and develop an analysis. Or story mapping, where you look at maps and geographies and spatial data and really think about how that connects with people's lived experiences, so that you are thinking about what justice could look like in a spatial and embodied way. These are some of the methods that our researchers used in order to collect data together. So we all worked together to do this. We explored those three key questions of what creates true community safety, what creates true community health, and what do we need to thrive? And we use a participatory action research framework to really create that knowledge. And participatory action research, for those of you that are new to it, is kind of like taking traditional research and activism coming together and they had a baby. That's participatory action research, because you're creating knowledge towards changing something. You're not just learning about stuff to learn about it, you're learning about stuff to really change, and typically change systems. And so it is an incredibly effective method when you're trying to design a new way of redistributing public funds to be based on the priorities of Black and Brown communities, especially communities that have been harmed by previous investments, as we saw in earlier videos. In this document, a part of the report, we really go through what each of those methods look like. But what I really want y'all to take away from this is just the sum of the richness of what our researchers did with us all together. Every single person that supported doing this research with us is a researcher in and of themselves. If I could recognize each of them individually, I would. My hope is that the third-party administrator who gets this RFP will be intimately familiar with the report that everyone worked so hard to create, that clearly identified what the priorities were, how we want this to go, and how important it is that this is done in a responsible way that is prioritizing that leadership, wisdom, and expertise of Black, Indigenous communities specifically as we build a new world together. And with that said, I'm going to pass it to Latanya as we talk about what community wants, because these priorities are the priorities for PB. And if you somehow miss these priorities, then I don't know if you can score highly on that RFP process. Go ahead, take it away, Latanya.
All right, can you scroll to the next one?
Yeah, you got it.
Sweet. All right, none of these should be super surprising, as you know, Sean mentioned. I think Black communities, Indigenous communities, a lot of our most marginalized communities have been very clear and vocal about these issues. And I don't think this is necessarily unique to Seattle. I think, but I do think that there's definitely some nuance in some of these. The number one most mentioned area of focus that came out of the research was housing and physical space. Again, probably not unique to Seattle, but definitely a very big issue in Seattle. Housing diversity specifically, and a need for more Black-led residential and Black-led commercial spaces. This priority was shared by non-Black people as well. Physical space is essential. We have a very substantial homelessness crisis here in Seattle, as well as a lack of affordable housing. The large majority of Black communities, specifically from our central area, have been pushed out of the city. I believe in the central district back, I think maybe 30 years ago, the numbers were like 75% Black. We're down to, I think we might be in the 30s now. That might be generous. So that was no surprise that housing and physical space was number one, but a close second was mental health. Again, we were doing this research during the pandemic, during the uprising. So clear that mental health has always been a high issue, one that really is extremely underfunded and inaccessible, particularly to Black and Brown folks. But during the pandemic and during the uprising, I think that there was an even higher need. Researchers and community members were adamant that we need new, culturally responsive and caring mental health networks led by people with lived experience, as well as a new and equitable payment structure that requires to ensure people receive proper care by appropriate healers. There's just not, due to the way that mental health services are paid for, there's just not a lot of folks who look like us who are providing those services. Typically those folks, their books are full and it's hard to get any appointments. Can you scroll just a little bit? Thank you. Number 3 was youth and children. As people saw also in the pandemic, childcare again also has always been an issue, but I think it was exacerbated by the pandemic and folks having to work from home, and folks who had to work outside of the home, but having childcare not available and out of school, after school options no longer available. It really became obvious, I think, to a lot more people, the importance of childcare. Also out of school time supports, particularly for children facing systemic violence and trauma, needs to be culturally responsive and be in good service to our Black and Brown youth and children. Economic development, the urgent need for economic relief to address the triple crisis of COVID-19, economic recession, and systemic racism. And crisis and wellness. There's a strong support for alternatives to the current harmful 911 and crisis response system, staffed by trained and skilled community members with lived experience. Seattle has seen some good movement in this direction. Our 911 has been moved out of our police department into, and it's civilianized now. It's still being kind of up and built up. Also, we saw with the funding for this research, also in the demands from last summer, folks were able to push for some funds to go to community alternatives to policing. So this is an area that has been growing slowly, and in no comparison to the budget that is being given to policing, but it's no surprise that crisis and wellness is another area because our current system is extremely harmful, and one of the areas where encounters with law enforcement can be extremely violent. I'll go through this quickly. So I think from those 5 things clear from the research, stop the cause causing harm, diverting criminal, legal, and foster care investments, eliminating worker and work that harms us, cutting police, courts, corrections, probation funding, reinvestment into community. That in and of itself is a big, kind of the foundation of PB. Creating more inclusive policies that prioritize workers with empathy and lived experience. A lot of times, people want to know what your credentials are. And I think that's a lot of the reason why folks always ask what me and Sean, they assume that we did the research and the analysis and the data collection. And our job was to make sure that folks had the support they needed to do the research that they wanted to do in their community. Include cultural and artistic expression and healing, fund community work first, simplify contracting. Simplifying contracting. Still got a ways to go, but I think, I think including some of the aspects that were included in this RFP and some of the other ones that came out of the demands last summer are making way for that, but making it not so hard for community-led orgs to be funded. And we hope that PB, as ideas get voted on, that getting those orgs funded or getting those projects funded is a seamless process that prioritizes the best interest of community. Following Black leadership, Black-led community organizations that specialize in the work, pay for community expertise. All the researchers were funded for this research, which is awesome. And finding a way to fund the people who helped through PB is crucial. There's a lot of positions, the steering committee, which we'll talk about a little bit later, some other roles that folks need to get paid for their time and expertise. And then invest in thriving solutions, like treating root causes, making it easier to find existing effective resources and programming, investing in anti-gentrification and permanent affordable housing. All were things that came out of this research. And I'll just add the 5 that I mentioned earlier we kind of call them buckets. You'll maybe notice that throughout the research. these are the 5 buckets that really came out of the research and are the things that will be the buckets that are used for the PB process in Seattle. That's why the research is important, and that's why this particular information here is important for how prioritizing the ideas that folks come up with will fall into these buckets during the next year's PB process. This slide makes me sad.
Yeah. It's like, this is community's timeline, and where are we at right now?
Yeah, it didn't quite work out, but yeah.
Yeah.
We tried.
We did. Do you want me to support on kicking off the steering committee?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So y'all, BIPOC-led work groups and committees supporting PB. Now, there are several different work groups that exist to support PB. In this RFP process, what this RFP is for the organization that is going to be supporting, doing like the hiring for people for these work groups. So this RFP is not for this like creating the steering committee. Like it's not like the RFP for the outreach work group. That's not what it is. This RFP process, whoever is supporting this work will need to be able to, and if they're working in alignment with the research, which is, you know, what you're supposed to do, you will be hiring on and like basically people to serve in this in ways that are described in the research. So every single work group, it's important that those who are most likely to be harmed or killed by systemic racism and violence are represented. This includes Black women who are trans, Indigenous women, people with disabilities, among other groups. So what's really important here is not necessarily this specific list that's, again, incomplete because it says among other groups, but that the folks that are really driving this are those who are most impacted, most affected, and have that lived experience and expertise. In PB, everyone can be part of the solution. And these are some of the work groups that will exist and will actually be running the PB process. There's the steering committee, which creates the rules in true partnership with the findings from our report, the Black Brilliance Research Project report, government workers, and participatory budgeting project. So the steering committee are community members who will be creating the official rules for what PB is going to look like. The Black Brilliance Research Project outlines in great detail what that process would look like. There's even like samples of meeting minutes and all this other stuff in it. But like that's the preliminary set of rules. The actual rules will be created by that steering committee that'll work with what community has said, which is represented by the Black Brilliance Research Project, government workers who can really understand like what are some of the systemic levers that can be pulled in order to achieve that, and participatory budgeting project, which has facilitated PB processes in multiple cities. The outreach work group, so they educate communities about participatory budgeting. They invite communities to participate in each upcoming stage of PB. They're not like the one group charge of educating everyone about PB. Community, this is community-led PB. Community will be doing a lot of that too, but this is the work group that is responsible for inviting communities to participate in each upcoming stage and really educating folks about where things are at. The accountability work group is focused on monitoring and receiving feedback about the decision-making process. They bring appropriate parties, together to resolve issues. That's the group that if you are like, how was this decision made? Or like, have we given enough feedback and like all this stuff, that work group is responsible for those components. And so from jump, creating a PB process where there's somebody who's in charge of that feedback loop and is like really supporting and building out that connective tissue is essential to this going well. So accountability work group, that's those folks. The budget delegates and process facilitators, that sounds kind of fancy, but really they're just pulling in information and making sure that PB is on track. And so, you know how sometimes there's some type of government process that kicks off and you're not really sure if things are going the way that they should be going, or you're just trying to figure out like what's going on, who has like the information about what's supposed to happen next. That's going to be your budget delegates and process facilitators. The lived experience work group ensures that PB is aligned with the lived experiences of communities while centering Black lived experiences. And so again, like we need to make sure lived experiences throughout, but this work group is really focused on that in particular. And then the restorative and proactive safety work group, make sure that PB is connected to the on the ground work and advocacy about community safety and healing. As we know, like COVID or 2020 was not like the first year that community has been on the ground taking care of each other. We know that through the last year and here in 2021 and now 2022, community continues to take care of each other because of longstanding relationships that have been built over a considerable amount of time. The restorative and proactive safety work group keeps that divest, reinvest conversation going, right? Keeps that focus on really being more proactive and not reactive to safety issues, and make sure that this work that we are all doing together as a community in the Seattle area is connected to that on the ground work and advocacy, and isn't just about like thinking about crises, but is thinking about healing and safety and thriving. So I'm looking at time and I think we're right on target to start digging in deeper. If you are watching the replay, this is a good time to stretch, but I'm going to keep going. The steering committee, the Black-led steering committee, is like all the work groups still focused on those who are most harmed or killed by systemic racism and violence. Those are the folks that are represented. Here we have the lived experiences in particular that community has said is really important to have on that steering committee. And it includes people who've been incarcerated. It includes people who are well connected to multiple community orgs. It includes people with lived experience with homelessness, people with disabilities, people who are trans, non-binary, and or gender non-conforming. It includes Black women. It includes older adults. It includes at least 2 youth and at least 1 person appointed by the Duwamish Tribal Services. It includes people from African diaspora, and it includes people from communities that are disproportionately impacted by negative health outcomes. What's really important to realize is that the steering committee and accountability work groups will be the first groups that'll be started. Together, they'll be developing and refining processes that'll hold all the PB work groups accountable to the community, adjusting as needed. Other work groups can start later in the process. So because we don't need budget delegates until there's like little, ballot-y type budget proposals to look at, that can happen later. But ultimately, we do not anticipate an RFP process for selecting the steering committee work groups or community members. There's a separate process for selection of what that looks like that's described in the report. What we do anticipate is that there will be a process where there will be a facilitator. There will be like a group that is sort of the container, and that this group will have expertise around doing participatory budgeting with community members in a community-led way, because we know that that expertise for being able to create a container for this kind of steering committee is essential to this going well. I'll take a quick pause here to be like, I had no idea when we were writing this report about the date of March. So if you're watching the replay and you're like, okay, this is going to happen in March, this was like, that March is not necessarily what is going to happen. But I want to clarify that just in case people are like, oh, it says March on the video. Okay, roles and responsibilities. The steering committee has roles and responsibilities that are detailed here, and you can read that in the report itself. We talk about what the selection process looks like, and we talk about a community jury process for that steering committee, and all of that is detailed in the report. So if you can imagine getting jury duty notice about being selected for a steering committee, like it's something like that, some tweaks on it, something like that, that'll happen to help decide that steering committee that still has these lived experiences represented. All right, city workers' roles, we can skip a little bit, but whoever is administering this needs to know that the city has roles to do. Typically, it is following community expertise, providing support, acting with the urgency of our communities, sharing records. This is really important. I don't know if I should highlight or not the fact that we have officials who are not great at record keeping. And so we want to make sure that the community knows and that the administrator knows that sharing records is a component of how the city can support, and that administrators should develop relationships with the city so that that can happen. And those records can be shared out with community so that community can really guide this process. Aligning city work is also important. So interdepartmental teams or groups of teams from different parts of the government working together to make sure that they're following that community-led component, and then sharing public channels. So using official city resources, kind of like we are right now, to amplify the messages from community, including things like the Seattle Channel, websites, and other city-owned channels. Now, this is useful for knowing what that looks like if you want nitty-gritty details about what city workers could be doing to support. The last couple of sections of this are just links, y'all. So if you click on these links, you'll get sample videos and sample carousels and sample templates so you can remix this kit to make it fit with what your community likes to see and engage with. And then finally, we have a section for how people can help. And that includes things like talking about PB, finding out about barriers in community, training up, like doing train the trainers like this, and start practicing outreach with community, as well as, I can't see the bottom of the screen, support. So that is going to be, boop, boop, boop. There we go. Sharing research from the Black Brilliance Research, and then checking out the work groups and experiences that are centered in leading PB so that you are knowledgeable about how to be a good supporter and champion and working alongside to create a community-led PB process that is supported by a third-party administrator. So I think that I'm just going to look through my notes to make sure that we've covered all of the main points. We talked about historical context, about that divest to reinvest strategy being core. We talked about some of the things that we know community really wants to see investment in, those 5 buckets. We talked about the overall strategy of the kinds of emphasis community wants to see in a process, such as following Black leadership. We covered a little bit about the research demographics of the researchers and the importance of relationships. We talked about the research methods that were used, including many methods that people are less familiar about. We did an overview of the PB roadmap and talked about some best practices of what makes for a good PB process. We talked about community priorities. And so I think at this point, it's a good time to pause and see if there's some really good questions for Q&A and open it up for more of a discussion. I will tell the audience that's watching the replay that we are joined here by some researchers who participated in the research process, which is delightful. And we're also joined here by community members who are not researchers. And so it's a really cool space to be sharing together today. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Q&A. Thank you so much. Also, housekeeping. You can put your questions in the chat, you can DM them, or you can ask them verbally, all are fine. Gratitude, that's great. I'm seeing, so y'all might not be able to see the notes on the replay. Ethics training was no joke. Yes, but so necessary. Yes, ethics training took some folks hours. We had, in some cases, we had to really step through the ethics training together in like workshops format and really talk through it. So there was a lot of attention on that, which is great. I see a question here that is asking for us to talk a little bit more about the role of the third-party administrator. Yes, okay, sure. So the third-party administrator, straight up, I'm gonna tell you, was not the original design of the research. The original design was that it would be going like directly, as direct as possible to community, that the city would contract with all of the folks that would be in work groups, and that would be how this would be implemented, and that community would be trusted with the power and expertise, and like everything would be able to move forward. And that is not what ended up being feasible for the city at this time. I'll say it that way. And so what was decided was that what could still happen to have a truly community-led, community-owned, community-generated process to have the appropriate separation between the city and whatever administration we might get and community, that there should be a third-party administrator that can commit to following what community's vision for this process is. And so the role of this third-party administrator isn't so much to, like, you're not picking the steering committee, like you're not picking the work groups, like you're not doing any of that, because that's not what people said they wanted. But instead, you are committing to this very complex process of having community really lead this, really be recognized as the experts in the room, while providing that administrative support to make sure, and coordination with the city to make sure that they have what they need to be effective in this role. So yes, it's a little bit of a different RFP process than you might be accustomed to, because you're not unilaterally deciding who's in and who's out. There's been a different process decided for that. And instead, you're committing to, as faithfully as you can, follow through this process that community has decided is essential for an effective PV process that addresses the harms done to especially Black and Indigenous communities in particular. So good question. Any other questions or things people want to say jumping off from that idea?
Sean, was that question shot to you directly?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a transcript, if people would send in general, that would be great because we'll have a transcript of it.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. I see a raised hand. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sean and Latanya, for that presentation. Just really astounded by how much work went into this groundbreaking research project. Wondering, you spoke a little bit about kind of your vision for the role of the city and city staff in this process, but wondering if you'd be able to speak to what your vision is for how the Office of Civil Rights can hold this process and help facilitate this process while it's still being a community-led PV cycle.
Ooh, this is a hot potato question. I'm going to answer very limitedly because I think this meeting is mainly to speak to the RFP. My sense is that the sheets, let me show y'all the slide we have on that question. It's a good question. Oops, let me hide all my mini tabs so y'all don't have to see that clutter. All right, check this out. So here we have this Train the Trainer. There's a slide that was probably one of the most important slides in the whole nearly 1,300 page report to answer that question. This says criteria and responsibilities for city departments providing support, and it talks about how community trusts of the departments that community has more trust in. OIRA, so Office of Immigrant Refugee Affairs, the Equitable Development Initiative Team, Office of Civil Rights, have more trust in those departments than the Department of Neighborhoods to help a community-led PV process. And then it talks a little bit more about Dawn, which is irrelevant because OCR is where things are at, the Office of Civil Rights. Here we see a role of what a coordinator might do. So that includes things like supporting the PV steering committee, supporting the training for PV participants, building partnerships, etc. The assistants, division manager. Now with a third-party administrator, I imagine these roles are less, even less of a lift than they would have been without one. And so I imagine the support for training for the PV participants will be more on the administrator side now that there's a third-party administrator versus it would have been a little bit more on the plate of the Office of Civil Rights. With again, most of the trainings for PV happening by community and a process that is able to use these train the trainer materials that we've created, as well as materials people will make for themselves and remix and reshare. Similarly, the division manager is supposed to interface between PV and other city departments, ensure open and timely communication, being transparent with other departments with especially during proposal vetting. I think these things are still going to be true. And the third party administrator will be working with like all of the city side folks involved to really coordinate and really carve out what makes the most sense based on this report and the capacities that they have. These components here provide community leadership, provide key supports. When we say community leadership, these are the kinds of things we're talking about. We are talking about community should be the ones that extend an invitation to departments before they start work, instead of departments just diving in and saying, well, here's what's going to happen. Similarly, for providing key supports, it's things like there's data that only the city really has adequate access to. And so sharing some of that data, especially mapping data and spatial data, to help really visualize racial equity and what it looks like. And so an OCR staff member supporting the PB process, like wouldn't be expected to do anything above and beyond what's here, but certainly would be doing these kinds of things in support of a community-led PB process, posting criteria like on a website, and providing technical support to community steering committees about like how the Office of Civil Rights works, things like that. We also talked about a little bit what we thought leadership could look like. One thing that I will say that I want to make sure that anyone watching this understands is this particular page, as well as many of the other pages in the report that talk about the city's roles, these were developed in part out of those office hours that I was talking to y'all about, where community and like government people and whoever else would come and give feedback and ask questions. And so we would say, like, we want a community-led PB process, and what does that mean to you? And what kinds of things can we anticipate? And we would have city workers tell us, well, if you really want this to be community-led, then you need to tell us that we shouldn't be the ones starting the work before community, because we literally don't realize that unless you tell us. Or like, what really needs to happen is you're talking about community leadership, but you need to be clear that you're not asking for more strategic advisors to exist in the city, to be hired into like these kinds of roles, and that instead you want that leadership to be held completely on the community side with community accountability methods. I'm just like, oh, that's not obvious, right? And so we really developed this out so that everyone can participate, but there's clarity around what that role looks like. And a third party administrator, in particular, when thinking about OCR's role, may find that page and then the pages and the full report connected to this that has a whole section on what the city is going to do, those pages to be useful as they're thinking about the role that they may have with OCR. Thanks for your question. Any other questions or discussion points?
I was just going to add to what a couple of things to what you were saying, Sean. I think in the report, it's important to remember that the roadmap wasn't written with a third-party administrator as an option. And so using the information in the city role pages, I think is most helpful in kind of understanding how some of the things you will help to facilitate kind of between the city and the community, as well as some of the roles you'll actually do instead of the city, more directly with the participants, the community members who are working in PB, is a good way to kind of look at those sections. But you're not going to find anything that says third-party administrator or some other entity would do these things because it wasn't written that way. I'll also add that I know the city there was conversation about interdisciplinary teams which might be something that gets used primarily because the information that will be useful for participatory budgeting is all over the city in a variety of departments, and the city might find it useful to use an existing or a new interdisciplinary team that helps hold the work for the city to make themselves most useful to community in this process.
Yeah, so if community says they're following those 5 buckets, you could imagine that there may be like a housing folks involved in the city side, but then there also might be human services folks involved, and like these folks are in different places in the city. And so you have to bring together people who have that kind of expertise to make sure that what community actually votes through will get followed through and funded. One of the biggest concerns we heard time and time again was like, maybe the city or maybe, you know, the government will listen to us, but they won't necessarily follow through. They won't put their money where their mouth's at, right? And so when we wrote the report, we had to hear, you know, we heard many stories about that based on previous experiences people had with the government. And when we created this report, it was really about honoring that, but also figuring out what kinds of mechanisms would help make that less likely to happen. Which is why, you know, sometimes people joke about how big this report is. They're just like, this thing is massive. Why'd you write all these, pages? Like, it's 12. The final report we turned in was 1,292 pages. And they're like, that's really long. No one's going to read it. It's like, okay, but the first 100 pages is the report, and the rest of it is the appendices. It is the roadmap for how to do research like this. It is the steps that are related to community engagement. It is the past PB processes that have happened. It is the steering committee guidance and like all of these different components to do a process that is aligned with what community was really pushing and advocating for. And it's the individual reports of all of the research teams and the work that they put in that bubbled up into the 100-page summary. And a third-party administrator, I don't anticipate a third-party administrator would necessarily be intimately familiar with City Council District 6's demographic data that was included as a part of that. But they might, want to pay attention to some of the specific mechanisms that community has held up as being important for what effective engagement looks like and running meetings. So I'm excited at what's possible. But Latania's right. Like, we had really designed this roadmap in mind with the processes that we were told by community and by the city about what could happen. And we're in a situation where what was decided was that if we want a truly community-led process, that a third-party administrator is our best bet at getting there. I would say, though, like personally, as Sean Glaze, that I think that there is a lot of potential for this work to be done and stewarded well. If it adheres to the things that we've so clearly identified, we could not have anticipated a third-party administrator option, but thankfully, because of the level of detail that we went into for this report, you could really start to understand and see what that could look like without having to spend another year of collecting data to find out. So I'm really proud of the work that the community members did to create this report. I'm proud of the work that the community has done organizing for decades to create the conditions that made this research possible. And I'm really proud to see what will happen in a community-led PB process as we move forward implementation. My kid's coughing up the lung, y'all. I'm gonna mute for a second.
Yeah, Sean and Latanya, if I can weigh in real quickly about the city's role. That was a good question, it was a great question. And that's part of our plan, is to convene an IDT of all the departments that are implicated in the 5 focus areas, right? The departments that would carry out the work around, physical space, housing, around youth and education. So that's definitely something that we're going to do. The other thing that we're asking the third-party administrator to do that we would have done, the city would have done had we not went to that third-party administrator's model, is we have to identify, so we're not redundantly putting resources in places that are already funded, right? So doing sort of a gap analysis around what's funding, and if there's in this process, if we can shore up those programs, right? But just to make sure the funding is not there's not a whole lot of overlap. So Yeah, and it's the IDT is just bringing together various city departments that will be charged with carrying out projects that are selected for sure.
There you go. I think my kid's done. Yeah, that's super helpful. I think it's exciting to have a chance to kind of demystify what this looks like. Yeah, demystify what it looks like on the city side. Because when we talk to community and we talk to city folks, here's a point that I think will resonate for whoever's watching this. City workers tend to think that community makes more distinctions about different departments and divisions than community does. And so like, if you're a city worker, you're like, oh yeah, like that's another division than my division, or like that's another department for my department. But when you're a community member, you're like, it's the city. And like, it literally could be like the city of Seattle, or like a partner that's not really the city. It could be like a transportation agency that has like, it's not even the city, but there isn't that level of clarity. There's not that level of detail, which also means that when one department messes up, like everybody ends up getting like taking the hit. That said, community is not completely agnostic. There is definitely some really clear guidance that we heard as we were moving through this process about which departments people have a little bit more faith in than others, and which ones aren't moving in ways that community like doesn't appreciate. And an interdepartmental team is exciting because you get people who are from different places hearing different pieces and have different relationship with community. And there is something really amazing that can happen when you bring together folks in that way. I'm excited for it to be supported in part by OCR because it is one of the departments that was listed out from community. I think that's a big, important move. And I know that the third-party administrator will be working with OCR perhaps a little bit more closely than other departments. And I think that's going to be a good sign. So I'm noticing we have about 20 minutes left of our time. And I know we don't necessarily have to go down to the wire, but I do know that I end up presenting about PB quite a bit. And so one of the things that I do think is important for the third-party administrator is to think about community engagement. So whoever gets this contract will need to have really effective community engagement. We talk about community engagement in more detail in the appendices. And so if you are curious about what that could look like, there you go, it's all laid out for you. But what I do know is that because a big part of the design of who is leading this, those steering committees, those work groups, et cetera, are folks who typically are pushed out of access to power, access to agency, access to the resources they need. That third-party administrator is really gonna have like care, understanding, and relational skills that are significant. They're going to have to be able to hold the weight of longstanding conflicts between different groups or different communities. They're going to have to be able to help foster people's faith in their own competencies to lead. Because if you've been told for decades, like most of your life, that like your opinion doesn't matter, and now you have the ability to be on a steering committee that's going to decide nearly $30 million worth of investments, you may feel some kind of way. And so having a third-party administrator that has that type of acumen, I think is important. And it's some of what you will see reflected in the appendices where we talk about the kinds of skill sets and supports to create a robust steering committee. We also talk about the fact that a lot of how important it is to have an accessible community engagement process, something that has as little barriers as possible, something that from jump centers those lived experiences. So it will have to look different than a lot of like existing community engagement processes. And that could mean that you really have to design something that is tailored to this environment. I'm hoping that people really pay attention to those appendices, because that's where we talk more about that and what it looks like, and provide some guidance based on some existing tools, some of which will look familiar if you're in the city or in the city of Seattle or the county, King County. What else do we talk about? We also talk about, we talk about a lot of stuff. Like Tanya's smiling. I'm just like, we wrote a lot, okay? Like,
Yeah, all the individual reports are in the appendices. And we had a lot of teams. There are a lot of reports in there. But some of the more rich project level data in those.
so good. Like people interviewed hundreds of people. There were focus groups. There's like all this stuff that wasn't in the first 100 pages. I think about this often, how there were like dozens of projects like through the research, and how hard it was to try to synthesize it into like the first 100 pages. Anyway.
Yeah, we had a squad. We had like the emergency. The goalpost got changed on us a lot during this project, and we had to get the report
earlier and earlier.
Done earlier than usual. But yeah, it was amazing to work with so many people to move through this work. Another thing that's in the appendix, I'm not sure if you mentioned, was we looked at other cities. I think specifically New York, and some of their PB processes, and we retailored them for Seattle. And so that's in there as well.
Yeah, the New York one is really interesting because New York's process is more, I would say like bureaucratic, more city focused. There really hasn't been a community-led PB process, anything like what we've designed. And so a third-party administrator hopefully will see the sections of the report that talk about, we did talk about New York. There's a couple of other documents in there that compare cities. And so you'll be able to look and see what some of the complexities are. It'll be helpful for the third-party administrator to be able to really think through like, okay, facilitating a what's identified here will require a different kind of engagement, outreach, component than something, in another city that's like a bit more bureaucratic. So understanding that. And then I think when we, one thing that's not in the report that I'll just mention casually is that King County kicked off its PB process. And so this month they're finishing their design phase, and next month they start collecting like actual like ideas. And so that's really exciting because we're in Seattle and then there's King County. How this connects to the report and the RFP is like really understanding the local context in those and how like power like works is essential to being able to do this well. It doesn't necessarily, the report doesn't necessarily say like it has to be, doesn't give a lot of prescriptions around that, but understanding the local context enough to where you can have a community-led process is essential. No matter what, even when the goalpost got moved, even when like things shifted with this thing or the other thing, at the end of the day, the ultimate goal, right, is to have a process that reflects those priorities that community entrusted in this process. The community trusted that, hey, if you really are about doing this work in ways that are accountable, the ways that are based on Black priorities, following Black leadership, if you're really going to create something that stops investing in the things that harm us and start investing in a thriving future, if you're going to create an accountable system that's accessible, all of those things we know we want, then we need to make sure that community leadership is first and foremost at the table and that it's well supported. We didn't say randomly have 30 people out there doing their own thing and good luck. Like that's not what we said. Even in the version where the city was going to be perhaps the facilitator, we identified key supports and what that would look like and who's going to do what, et cetera. And so and we talked about the importance of having people who understand a participatory budgeting process as a component of that. Because if you don't understand it, you can't just suddenly get caught up even by reading a report like this and expect that it'll go well. There are a lot of components, and with a project like this, one of the biggest fears people told us in their research was that any one little thing would go amiss, and then that would be used to justify continued investments in the systems that harm us. There was certainly like an anxiety that is so difficult to put into words, and I was like very careful about how we worded this in the report, but there's a concern in community that if this isn't done well, then it'll be used to justify continued harm. And so this third party administrator like needs to understand that there's an impact to messing this up. See, I didn't swear this time. And so therefore, like taking on that sense of responsibility, truly understanding the implications of every single action that you take and how it's going to really bring forward like community-led process is essential to executing this work correctly. And this report is one step towards making that clear so that people can't say, well, we didn't know like what the priorities were. We didn't know what that context was. We didn't know that it was supposed to be connected to this like divest, reinvest thing. It's like, you got no excuse. We wrote it all down. We made you a kit. We did a train the trainer. We have templates. We exist in the world. And I'm excited to see what comes out of this application process, because I truly, truly believe that the RFP as written now reflects a process that could get us to that outcome. So with that said, I know I've been talking for a while. Latanya knows me. I can certainly go on and on about this forever. I would love to turn this back to our two hosts who have brought us here today from the Office of Civil Rights. And yeah, I think we can start closing out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. I should have I'm going to put my contact information in the chat, but my email is, I should share my screen, but I don't have that slide available just yet. My contact information is Emmanuel.dasilva@seattle.gov. And that's EMANUEL.DASILVA@seattle.gov. If you have any questions about this, I can't thank you to more for doing this work and sharing it with us again. Sean and Latanya, really appreciate this. It was really informative, and I'm sure many folks who see this video are also going to be, just have a much more a head up in their application for this third-party administrator. John, do you have anything else to say before we close out?
No, I'm like you, Mano. I was trying to get to your contact information screen. I'm like you. I'm so appreciative, so grateful that Latanya and Sean came and laid the report out, and just to emphasize why it was so critical for us to have this info session geared around this report, because we point to this report in the RFP. We point to this report, and we use words like fidelity and a process, an application that shows fidelity and to the spirit and vision of this report. And what that means in layman's terms, what that means is, as Sean said, we've laid it out. We've done a train. We're in the world. We exist in the world. You can contact us. We've done the research. We've done a lot of research. These are the areas, right? And this is the roadmap. It's not the only roadmap. I'm sure there may be one other organization or two other organizations in the PB ecosystem. I have to assume, I just assume there are other organizations in the PB ecosystem. But when we talk about what's specific to Seattle, right? This is not a cookie cutter deal, right? And Sean, it almost brings me to tears that we know if this is not ran as an effective product and an effective process, then because they already using language like pilot, but in our case, we know sometimes pilots are just a one-shot deal, and any pilot can be a one-shot deal. So I just want to emphasize those two things, and it was so critical for Sean and Latanya to come here and talk about that report extensively. And and I need to thank him again. There you go. Thank Jackie for being so attentive and providing a lot of admin support and just being here. And reach out to Mano if folk have questions. Folk have a very specific question just around the process, the application, the submission. Reach out to Mano. This info session is going to be posted. This recording is going to be posted on the website. The previous info session this past Tuesday, December 7th, will be on the website tomorrow. And as well as the questions that have come out of this session and the previous session. Mano, we have one more info session coming up on the 14th. Is that correct? Coming up Tuesday, December 14th, 5-7. You want to talk a little bit about that? Or whatever you want to talk about, close us out.
Yeah, please come to the next info session. We want to make sure to answer any questions that people might have during that session, but also make sure people feel comfortable filling out the budget. It's going to be great. 5 to 7. Excited to have you all there. All right. Thank you so much again. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
And I'll end the recording. Thank you all.